board of directors here at PSCA. I'm from Erie County, and I'm from the great snowy north. We've already had about a foot of snow already this year. It's gone now, which is good. It comes and goes at this point, but yeah. So I'm from Erie. This is my esteemed panel. Would you care to introduce yourselves?
Hi, everybody. I'm Deepa Sekhar. I'm a general pediatrician with Penn State. I've been there about 15 years now and have had the pleasure of working both with Perri and Steve on some of the information we'll share with you today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Perri Rosen. I'm a school psychologist. I work at the Department of Human Services, the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services in Harrisburg. And my role has mostly been as part of our youth suicide prevention grants that we've had at the state level in Pennsylvania. I also help to oversee SAP, the Student Assistance Program, at the state level.
My name is Steve Sharp. I'm a middle school counselor at Lansville Middle School, about 10 minutes away. And I also am the K-12 school counseling coordinator. I've previously been on the PSA board and currently on the ASCA board.
Excellent. Okay. So real quickly, a show of hands, how many of you in here have experience with some kind of mental health screening at your school? Looks like, I'd say maybe 60%, would you say?
I don't do math. I'm a counselor.
Well, and my estimation was probably really way off, but we'll go with the 60%. So from what I understand, what they've told me in the last 5 minutes or so, I'm going to ask questions and they're going to answer them. During this presentation, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to speak up, raise your hand, and we'll make sure that you get all the information that you need. That's what's the most important part here. All right.
If you do me a favor, for any of our virtual people, if they ask a question in the audience, just repeat it so virtual people can pick it up on the microphone.
Okay.
Thanks.
So here's a question. How do I get the virtual people's questions?
They won't be asking questions but they can hear the questions of the people in the audience.
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. All right. This is good. All right. So the first question is, could you please speak briefly about your work with Penn State Pro Wellness, and how the issues of depression screenings in schools came about?
Yeah, so I'll take that one and provide a little background. So as I mentioned, I'm a general pediatrician. I also run a center at Penn State called Pro Wellness. The Pro stands for Prevention, Research, and Outreach. And we have a whole bunch of community-based programming, much of it in schools, educational programming, and research work. So one of our research studies that's relevant to today's conversation is the SHIELD study. SHIELD stands for Screening in High Schools to Identify, Evaluate, and Lower Depression. So this was a randomized clinical trial of school-based depression screening. We worked with 14 schools throughout the state of Pennsylvania, over 12,000 students, and basically were able to demonstrate that screening was 6 times more likely to identify students with symptoms of depression, and these students were twice as likely then to start treatment.
That's impressive.
All right. Anybody else want to address that question?
Well, so I'm not with Penn State Pro Wellness, but I did have the opportunity to work with Deepa as a stakeholder on that project, which was really incredible just because as part of the study, there was a stakeholder group that was working in an ongoing way that included the research team, but also included community members. It included youth directly. It included educators and others that could basically be involved in the research study in an ongoing way. And I think when it comes to something like universal screening in schools for mental health, that's obviously something that hasn't always been in the wheelhouse of schools and is something that is really growing nationally and also has been growing a lot in Pennsylvania. But it was really neat to just kind of be involved as a stakeholder, to just be able to kind of see what the research team was doing, see how youth were giving input and learning from that process. And just kind of seeing the iterations to the project that were coming as a result of getting input along the way. Typically, researchers don't really work with the community when they do their studies, and a lot of times in schools, they come in and do what they need to and then leave. So I think kind of having the youth voice in particular, but also just having that opportunity for collaboration was really exciting. And then separately through the grant work that I've done in Pennsylvania, it's been through our Garrett Lee Smith Youth Suicide Prevention grants, which come federally from SAMHSA. We also have been piloting universal screening in schools using a different measure. So I know Deepa will probably talk about the measure that they used in the SHIELD study. But that actually came about in our project. We were looking at implementing screening through systems like SAP. And through systems that already do that kind of screening. And so the work that I've done with universal screening in schools was actually driven by schools that were interested in feeling ready to do this work to identify students in a more proactive way. And Hempfield School District was actually one of our very first partners going back to 2016, really looking at the needs of students around mental health and trying to figure out ways that they could, again, more proactively identify students. So the work that I've gotten to do actually was really driven by schools that were looking for a tool and a resource and support to do that. And then kind of just grew from there to various districts and intermediate units throughout the state.
As Perry said, I was a guinea pig, but specifically addressing the question, Penn State Pro Wellness, I'm just a very big fan of Deepa's work and the program.
And so, Steve, how does the program work in your school?
I think we'll have a chance to talk about it a
Oh,
little bit.
okay. I was sorry, skipped ahead. And how many years have you been doing the screening?
So I guess I should rewind a little bit. The project itself was a 3-year grant, and schools, we worked with the schools on screening. They had one academic year in which they would implement screening, and then we would follow outcomes with the student assistance program. I'm looking at the question thinking I probably didn't actually answer what you asked me, what was how it came about. And so I think it came about because I was completing school physical forms in our primary care office, and their school physical forms, that's what they are. We have BMI and scoliosis and a dental clearance, for crying out loud, but there's nothing on the whole form that asks if kids are in a good headspace to be successful in schools, which is where this idea of partnering with schools came about. And we talked about this a little bit previously, in our conversations, but schools already do hearing, they do vision screens. The goal of doing those screenings is to identify students with barriers to academic success. And no one's ever argued with me that depression is a barrier to academic success. So that's where the idea of positioning the screening in the schools came about, but it was a 1-year screening that they were involved with us on.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions? Not so far. Good. All right. Okay, so the next question is, why is depression different in adolescents and adults? I'm gonna bump forward that one. Let's see. Oop. Oop. Yep. Oh, wait. Well, let's open it that way anyway. As we know as school counselors, that's depression looks different from adolescents and adults. How does it look different from your perspective? Will everybody answer this one? How does depression look differently?
It looks different in a lot of different ways. The reality is that we understand depression is one of the leading disabling categories when it comes to adult employability and work. And it's it's a significant barrier. If we look at the Pennsylvania Youth Survey right now, for the most recent year, 2021, it should have your attention. You should be very concerned, particularly when it comes to the reported symptoms of both depression and anxiety for 10th and 12th graders alone. Those rates are over 40%. That's saying almost half of our classrooms have students reporting depression, anxiety, alone having feelings of either suicidality or hopelessness, which also were concerning, and the higher than any previous reporting year. And so when we talk about it, what we understand is we have students in just broad-based surveys self-reporting these concerns. And so having more granular measures to directly engage with our students and then assist them in their help seeking, it seems like just a necessary step.
Yeah, I think as Steve mentioned, we definitely have seen those increases. You all have probably seen those happening firsthand. And I think when it comes to depression in schools, obviously we're much better at identifying those externalizing behaviors, right? Which in some cases may be an indicator of some sort of internalizing concern, depression or anxiety. But a lot of times in schools, I'm sure you've all seen that kids can mask a lot of those symptoms. And they're not often the types of things that stand out to educators in the classroom because those kids tend to be quieter. They're not showing the range of behaviors that really put people on alert, that lead to those referrals, that lead us to identify and refer kids to our teams to look at what interventions we could provide. So I think that a lot of the conversation around screening, to kind of tie it back to that, really has come up around this issue of internalizing behaviors, how we go about identifying them, and some of the disproportionality and misidentification that comes from those externalizing behaviors, the disparities and disproportionality we see by race, ethnicity around some of those things. So thinking about this in the context of the screening conversation, I think this gives us a more objective way to look at these kinds of issues that our youth may be experiencing. And we know that youth are pretty open and honest when they need to report on screeners. Like when they are asked these questions, they're likely to be honest and report openly and directly. And so it just kind of fits into, you know, the broader continuum of what we would do, knowing about what our PACE data is showing us, knowing about the increases, gives us like this other tool in our toolbox to really try to find these kids, especially knowing that data that we have, like our PACE, is anonymous. Right. So we're seeing these issues, we're seeing them trending. We only know the kids that are showing up for some of those behavioral issues or coming to our door and seeking help, which we know a lot of kids aren't inclined to do. So it's kind of just one of those pieces that fits into that toolbox and that continuum of supports.
So I think what I will add is, in terms of depression symptoms in teens, I think one of the tricky ones is irritability. So a lot of the times they will just be irritable and snappy, and like it's not what you might see with an adult. So I usually remember that one. And then in comment to the screener and the idea of honesty on a screener, one of my favorite reviewer comments was, what if teens lie on a screener? And I felt like I wanted to get this individual in front of me and be like, you've never lied on any screening tool given to you. So, you know, they might lie, right? Like part of it for me was just opening the door and asking the question, right? Like, and kids have told us over and over again, they know exactly what they have to put down on that screening tool that's going to prompt, you know, you guys to call them into the office, right? If they're not ready to talk, they're not ready to talk, right? Like all you can do is offer the opportunity.
You know, just thinking about that, Deepa, it also makes me think in my own professional experience, like we work with our elementary schools to do screenings, and we do in our middle school up through the high school. And the reality is, like, our students have life experience, our students have internal experience, but sometimes our students haven't yet developed the language, the adult language, to describe that experience. The screening tools provide a chance to invite them into that conversation. It also sometimes frames the experience that they have been living for days, months, weeks, years, but haven't had a way of conceptualizing it and putting it in front of them in different ways as well. And those can be the spark for really meaningful conversations as well.
Yeah, and on my screening tools, I'm always under 25.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. The next one is, so let's not move on to that one yet. The next question I have on here, which is a really, really good one, is what do health screenings look like currently for adolescents, and what are we already doing for students?
Yeah.
So I guess I can briefly speak just about, a big part of my role is with the student assistance program. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that. How many of you sit on your SAP teams? Okay. And how many of you have, great, Steve. How many of you have SAP liaisons that support the screening or assessment? Yeah. So a lot of our efforts, you know, in Pennsylvania around screening in this area with youth in schools obviously are coming from our SAP system. So we have the SAP liaisons, as all of you know, and you know that's one part of their role. If there's an underlying concern about mental health or drug and alcohol, their role would be to screen or assess to see if there's something further that they could be recommending in the school or in the community. So that's a huge part of it. And then in schools, what schools are tending to do is within their multi-tiered frameworks, right? Looking at either screening for academics, screening for just behavior, right? Or screening for social emotional skills. So mental health screenings or behavioral health screenings that we're looking at in schools are really getting more into like the symptoms of mental health challenges and the symptoms of behavioral health challenges, which again hasn't always, you know, really fallen under the purview of the school, but is something that schools are really seeing themselves as having a place in doing moving forward, especially given all the concerns in the data and the opportunities that are in schools for early identification and intervention. But I don't know if you want to talk about within the primary care realm or if you had other.
I mean, we routinely do depression and anxiety screening. So the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force just released that report you guys may have seen for the anxiety screening for adolescents, which was a big deal and I think pretty relevant coming out of the pandemic. But we've been doing the depression and anxiety for a while now. We touched on a little bit what measures. So we use the patient health questionnaire adolescent version in the office. For the study I mentioned, we chose the patient health questionnaire 9 because there is only one question on that, item number 9, that asks about suicide risk. And that was kind of a question that, you know, had schools a little bit more stressed out. So for the study, we actually worked with the student assistance program teams on the front end to say, you know, your administration is on board with this. This is what we want to do, but let's like resource map and figure out, like, you screen, you're going to find more kids. So like, where are we going to send these kids to? And so, yeah, we spent a lot of time with them figuring out like what linkages they currently had available. On the screening day, even some of the schools, especially the larger ones, we had a certain number of kids that answered item number 9, anything but a 0. They had to be dealt with that day, right? So, you know, they would tell us, you know, we have a cap number of, you know, whatever, 10 kids or 8 kids. And so as you screen throughout the day, when we hit that cap number, that's all our counselors can handle. So we're going to call the screening for the day and have you come back in a few days so we have time to deal with those students. So, I mean, those were some of the issues that came up in terms of pulling a screening that, you know, is done in the primary care office out into the school setting and how we were going to logistically manage the student flow.
Yeah. For our screenings, again, we were fortunate enough to kind of partner with the state earlier on and have a chance to work on a few different models. Specifically in my district, we'll either do like large group 2-stage screens. We'll bring large groups of students in. Everyone gets an exit interview, just reviewing their results. And then students that we feel like we need to further clarify some of their responses, specifically along the lines of either child abuse or suicide risk. Then we'll have a third and more intensive interview from there, just to really glean out what they're kind of trying to share in those circumstances. Separate to that, some of our counselors prefer doing a cohort model. So they take the same large group of students, but instead of having all like 50 or 80 of them in one large group, they'll break them down to being like screening 3 or 4 students a day across like a 3 or 4 week period. So it's the same chance for a student to participate in the screening. It's the same chance to have that exit interview and have time for more intensive interviews. They've just mapped it out over several days instead of one large screening. Like when it comes to other ways how we understand done here, particularly in South Central PA, and really sometimes districts do bring in a third party to do some of those practices. We talked about the use of SAP services as well. Within my district, I do like that our school counselors are the leads in this process, because not only do we have ongoing relationships with the students and the families to have some context for those results, that wouldn't necessarily be the case with a third party group. We also are deeply familiar with our school intervention processes, and with it come with our both internal resources and external resources to make sure that we're connecting students as well. What Deepa really referenced to is like screening is not a process in isolation. Like if you screen, you must intervene, and like resource mapping and understanding the supports and services that are across a continuum available for students is just as important, if not more important, than the screening process in and of itself.
I just want to comment on a couple of things that you said. There were a lot of really great things you said, but so just to back up for a second, because the screening tool, so Deepa talked about the PHQ-9. Obviously, for doing mental health screening in schools, that's, you know, one of the first questions that schools need to figure out is what exactly do we want to measure? What data do we want to gather? Are we looking specifically at depression? Do we want a tool that's going to be focused on a single domain? Do we want something broader that's going to give us data on multiple domains? And all of that, you know, there's just a lot of discussion around, you know, what is it that we want to look at? And just to kind of share, so for our grant, and our grant is still ongoing, we've been using a screening tool called the Behavioral Health Screen, developed by Dr. Guy Diamond. He's at Drexel and his colleagues. And that is the tool that Hempfield has used in several other districts in Pennsylvania through our pilot work. And so it differs from the PHQ-9 in that it's a broad-based measure. It does cover about 13 different behavioral health domains. And so it's giving a lot of information, which may or may not be something that schools are wanting at one point in time. But that's obviously a consideration for some of the procedural things that Steve was talking about, because you're getting this information coming out of a screen. You're looking at a variety of things like suicide, you're looking at trauma, you're looking at depression, anxiety, bullying, eating disorders, right? A whole gamut of potential issues. And so not only does it take a lot of planning and preparation time, which we can definitely talk more about, I think that's probably in the questions coming up, but also is a lot for schools to kind of parse through and think about procedurally. So to the point about, we're not screening in isolation, with the SHIELD study as well, we were taking these data and putting them in context of other information that we have in schools, which is one of the really great things about screening in schools, is that it's in context, and schools often have a lot of other data and information they can look at along with the screen. Screens are not diagnostic, right? So you're not screening and then saying this child has major depressive disorder or this child has PTSD. It's just an information gathering tool, and it's one piece of information that needs to be put in that context to really figure out those next steps. So because schools have, such strong teaming structures with your PBIS or MTSS teams, with your SAP teams, being able to kind of funnel that information and put it in greater context is really, I think, one of the greatest benefits of doing screening in schools, because you have multiple people looking at this information, these kids, then you're getting some additional information that can be just another piece of the puzzle that then can direct these processes that are already underway and established in the schools.
Perri, I'm just going to add two quick things to that. So totally agreed with you that you have to be thoughtful about the type of screening tool that you choose. One thing we did find, because this came up, we had schools ask us if we could just get rid of question 9, because I told you that was like the pain point, right? Like that was the, oh my God, we got to do something right away about this. And I get it, right? Because it's stressful. So we actually looked at that, and the PHQ is not a suicide screening tool, but the evidence supporting asking a suicide question was there. So you were like 8 times more likely to be identified, and then 4 times more likely to end up initiating some type of treatment with a positive on that item number 9. So we did pick up kids that nobody knew about. Like anecdotally, we were told by the schools, we didn't even have this kid on our radar. Part of me felt like if we saved somebody's life by doing the study, like whatever the results of the study were, right, it was worth it. So wanted to make that comment. I also, when you talked about the advantage schools have over the primary care office, the teens told us this. We did focus groups with teens and parents even before we did the screening at some of these schools, just to get a pulse on how they perceive depression and, what they would do with their teen. The kids were very clear that they did not think about the doctor as a place to sort of disclose mental health issues, which is really humbling for me. But yeah, they said, that would be weird. Why would I talk to this person about this? And, I get it in retrospect, right? For many of these kids, I meet them for the first time for 20 minutes, and then I think they're going to spill their guts. Like that's silly, right? So yeah, I think embedding it in a place where they are every day makes a lot of sense.
So one more comment to the first point you were making, and I don't think this was the case with the SHIELD study, but I know in our pilot work. So one of the biggest fears I think that schools have in doing this type of screening is that they're going to all of a sudden be inundated, right? Yeah. With all of just like, oh my gosh, we're going to get all of these kids that are suicidal and not be able to respond adequately. And that has not been the case in our efforts. And both of you, I'm curious if you want to speak to that too, but we know that, as Deepa had said, we also, like anecdotally through our efforts, have heard that in every incidence of screening, there 100% have been students identified that were not previously on the radar, students that, did need some sort of immediate response, sometimes a connection to crisis, but that it wasn't this whole, like, we're opening the floodgates and all of a sudden we just have like all of these kids are suicidal. In our data that we've gotten from the behavioral health screen, our suicide, like specifically looking at the suicide data that's come out of that, it has mirrored the PAYS with regard to percentages of students that report like a history of ideation, which was around like 16%, has increased a little bit of students that are being screened. As far as like current ideation, so students that are reporting like thoughts within the past week, that's been around 2 to 3%. So schools have not come back to us and felt like this has been totally unmanageable. We've been totally inundated by doing this. It has been more of the, oh my gosh, you know, we did identify kids that we didn't know were at risk. And it's interesting because some of the initial pushback to doing universal screening was from some of the school mental health professionals. And I'm a school psych too. So school psych, school counselors that feel like, you know, we know the kids that are struggling. We don't, you know, this isn't going to add anything, you know, what are we really going to gain from this? But that have come back and said, you know, no, there have been issues, there have been concerns, there have been kids, but it hasn't, you know, totally floored us to be able to respond appropriately. And as Steve mentioned, they've taken careful time in planning so that they're not blindsided for the students that they do need to respond to when the issues do come up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just doing the math, doing these types of screenings about 50 times now. Absolutely, we always find, we refer to as like the diamond in the rough, the kid that we would not have been almost every screening. And I do have to agree with Perry, just like the percentages on like of students who are actively suicidal is something that, again, plays out pretty well mathematically in most circumstances. And so, but the difference is, you get to plan when you're going to have that discussion in your workday and not have it be 2:59 on a Friday afternoon. Like you can have additional staff there. It's not like these students are not suicidal out there. They're suicidal, but there's a chance we have the opportunity to plan when we're gonna have the conversation with them, which is unique and highly valuable. We can make sure like we have additional support staff available so that we can have 2 conversations at the same time. And again, meaningfully engage with them when it comes to help seeking, problem solving from there.
I have a question. Could you just again repeat what the SHIELD acronym is?
Oh, yeah. So
The question is, what does the SHIELD acronym stand for?
it is screening in high schools to identify, evaluate, and lower depression. And yeah. You got it. Yeah, no, you're so welcome. I will just add that, you know, after we did this with all these partnering school districts, we did go back to them and share the results back with them. And, you know, I thought I had picked a tool that was easily available. You can download the PHQ off the web. And we had worked with SAP teams and they did everything. My research team was there. We did the PHQs on an iPad because we had to put them into a secure database, but we didn't have student names or anything. The school managed all the follow-up. And so I was like, you guys did this, like you did great, like go ahead and, you know, do your thing. And they all looked at us and they were like, so what do we do next? And I'm like, what do you mean? You're not ready to go? And so we have come to the conclusion that like it was a great experience going through this with them, but I feel like schools are looking for some more professional development in this space. Yeah, so I've roped Perry into working with me again on a follow-up project where we will be offering professional development to school districts, you know, to try to get this up and off the ground, because I do think the preparation is a big deal. We talked about being inundated, and one of the things one of our collaborators talks about is, you know, you don't wake up and decide you're all of a sudden going to screen a whole grade, right? You don't do that, right? Like maybe you start with a classroom of 10 kids or 20 kids, get your feet wet, figure out your process and make sure you're comfortable. Like nobody should walk into that screening day stressed out that they don't have a plan for how to manage it. By the time you get to screening a grade or a school, you should be very comfortable in your process.
And I think because our grant work wasn't a structured research study, we had a little bit more leeway and ability within how our grant was set up to be. So the schools were doing, you know, all the work and same as Deepa had said, but we were able to work with them and offer technical assistance. I think being a state agency, we weren't really positioned to say, here's exactly what you need to do, right? The schools needed to come to us and say, here's how we're structured, here's our resources, here's how we want to do this. And honestly, each and every school that did this in a slightly different way. Like we had some parameters and some guidance, but they really had to make it their own. And we worked with them in some cases for almost a year to just get started and ready to screen. In schools, I know everyone wants everything to happen like that. A new idea comes up and it's like, okay, when can we start? When can we do this? And unfortunately, something like this, because of the nature of the data, because of, you know, what you're really dealing with does, as Deepa said, really need to be very carefully planned. So I would say on average, we worked with schools for about 6 months. And some of the things that we worked with them on were creating those step-by-step procedures. You know, how are you thinking about the day of the screen? How are you going to, you know, Steve mentioned some of this. Are you going to do large group? Are you going to do small group? Are you going to have students called down one by one? You know, like there's just a lot of little details like that. How are you going to address confidentiality, right? So let's say some students screen positive and some don't. How are you going to make it so that not everyone knows those kids over there, you know, have to be seen by someone, whereas these kids can go back to class? There's just those kinds of things to be thinking about. And so schools really had to pull their teams together, think about how they wanted to do this, and really just outline that step by step. So that was a big part of it. Also, because ours was a broad-based screener, they were looking at kind of like the triaging aspect of it. So, so what issues would need to be dealt with immediately, right? Obviously, suicide-related concerns and things like that, versus what are the issues that we need to deal with in a time-sensitive way, but don't necessarily need to deal with right this second, maybe within a few days or up to a week, right? Identifying those issues. And then other, you know, issues that anyone maybe that didn't screen positive, but still needed a touch point. What are we going to do with those? And really just break that down. The other things were really just informing the school community. How are we going to engage families, right? And in our project, you know, so consent and how we're going to do consent is always a big question. In our project, because it was federally funded, we had to do active consent, but schools, you know, can decide how they want to do that. To one of the points that Deepa made, I think that really helped keep things small for starters, so that schools could have a little bit of a more contained group to be able to pilot their procedures and then gradually scale up. But it was a requirement of our project. So how are we engaging families? How are we going to let them know what we're doing and why this is important to us? What is our consent form going to look like? Are we going to get student assent? And then, you know, how are we going to just let our board know? Do we need board approval? How are we going to convince people that this is something we want to do, that we need to do? So all of those pieces are really, you know, what went into some of the planning phases. And I think that kind of gives us pause when we think about, you know, schools just diving into something like this, because it's definitely not something we would recommend be done that way.
Yeah, and just kind of the last piece, just kind of pivoting off what Perri said, like Perri has been a great partner and my personal therapist over the past few weeks, because we actually aged out of the grant. And so we had a chance to really reevaluate what we were doing when it came to our screening processes. And we as a staff were not completely on the same page, let alone across the district, but there were some things that we did have some commonality for. Everyone agreed like this was a valuable service to our work with students. It was valuable for the students, it was valuable for the school community, and valuable for us as school-based mental health professionals to have these resources and connections. There was no discrepancy there amongst our school staff. Who was going to administer? There was some question as far as that, but when we really started to talk about it, who were the most experienced in doing so? And would we be willing as a school counseling department to continue to absorb this due to our commitment of feeling like this is such a strong and important service? The answer to that was yes, ultimately. And that was pretty uniform against all our staff. And then when it came to, are we going to try and recreate the wheel or use established procedures and practices we already do, and also a network of support that we already have access to? That was also yes, which had us continue with a lot of our same practice again. But those were very intentional conversations over about a 6-month period of time. It's not saying like our way is the way everyone should do so, but it is being intentional in having those conversations as far as capacity, as far as intentionality. And I think we landed with doing a lot of these same things that we did before. Not that we won't change them over time, but again, there isn't, I think, a certain urgency of wanting to do that now. I think for the purpose of time, we are going to jump ahead to maybe implementation question.
And
Yeah.
I think there was a question.
Oh, and there was a question in the audience.
Was that? Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's quick, I think. Would you have to get the same type of permission, like how you're talking about? We did team screen a while ago.
Yeah.
at schools, and like all of us, every level had to come up and help in screening and interviewing kids and whatnot, whether you were elementary, middle, or high. And of course, we had to get, parental consent, student consent, but if you were doing that in a PCP setting, you just don't have to have that kind of consent for them to do the screening.
So in the primary care office, we don't, but the parents are there. And in some cases, I struggle with this because in some cases I walk in and the parent is reading the questions to the kid and I'm like, well, this is working really well. So for the SHIELD study, we did use an opt-out consent. The overall study opt-out rate was 2%. And I will say it varied pretty significantly by individual schools, though. When we went back to talk to people year 3 about their experience with the screening, most of the people who came to do the kind of exit interviews with us had actually no recollection of the screening whatsoever. I mean, there was COVID in there, but I was somewhat like, oh, this is good, right? Like, it's not like they were like, oh my gosh, they screened us, right? Like, it was something they were sort of like, oh, this happened. I don't really remember anything about it. So yeah, I didn't totally answer your question, but we don't in the primary care office.
In the literature, clearly you're going to get a lot more students and remove a lot of systemic barriers to access to this valuable service through passive consent. With that being said, it's also clear for some of the things when it comes to the vulnerability when it can be sharing some of this intimate information that active consent is also be an important therapeutic tool for different reasons.
And I was going to say, we've done mental health screening at our school for a couple of years. And one of the things you're talking about was the inundation. And it's like when some people's perception is that if we give a mental health screening, it's going to create all these mental health problems. It's like, no, it does not create the mental health problems. It puts a lens on those mental health problems so that you have a focus and a direction to go. And in our experience, like when we do the mental health screening, you do see the kids that are already getting services. Those kids pop up, but every once in a while you do see a kid who's had nothing that is even on your radar that pop up for a severe score on their mental health screening, and those are the kids that you need to target to get some help. And we've seen that instance that Steve has talked about, where that you're saving lives when you talk to a kid who's had a plan for suicide but has never popped up anywhere else before. So I mean, that's one of the values of the mental health screening. In this day, and unfortunately in this day and age, I mean, we all know that this kind of a politically sticky climate, and there are some parents who are very against the mental health screening, but I think that that's a battle worth fighting for saving lives of kids. So the question is, I think this will probably be the last question. What are the steps that we can implement to statewide and nationwide?
Yeah, I think at least one important thing here in Pennsylvania that is different, even from previous years, is with this, like from the federal money that created the Pennsylvania school safety grants for this year. For a lot of the ways that we are actually having access to the grant, screenings are part of that paradigm through the PCCD grant. And so this is something that really a lot of school districts should start exploring as far as capacity and understanding, because this is really how you can access a lot of different financial support for students, let alone the value of the practice in and of itself. But really what I like about the PCCD grant structure is like a lot of these things to create systemic mental health support, including not just universal screening, but then multi-tier systems of support, access, again, when it comes to having intervention structures after that. Like that's embedded in the grant and money is attached to it at the same time, which is not the case before. And so this is a unique opportunity, but when we talk about scaling it, the financial structure is there. It's whether or not your central administration teams are aware of, they should be including that as a part of the structure.
Yeah. So I would say, like, there are recommendations from the National Center for School Mental Health to consider mental health screening as part of comprehensive school mental health approaches. One kind of piece of that, looking at, again, a multi-tiered continuum, and just, again, a piece of that puzzle. And in Pennsylvania, obviously we're a Commonwealth, so at the state level, it's not something that is necessarily going to come through as mandates, although I will say, at least on our grant team where we have this resource that we can make it available to any school in the Commonwealth to use it. Some of our team members that aren't from the schools have said, why aren't we just, giving this to every school and putting this in every school? And I feel like I'm often the one that, even though I talk about this a lot and how beneficial it is, I'm often the one that tries to like press the brakes on that a little bit, just because I feel like there really does need to be an infrastructure to support this. And not all schools are in a position to just, turn around and do this. And they have a lot of work to do to get ready. Obviously, some of the things have already been mentioned today, but looking at, who is the team really that's going to spearhead this effort. It's not really something that one person can lead on their own. Although I will say that every time we've done this, there are definite champions that are advocating for this and pushing for this, and the ones that are speaking out to the school board and the ones that have looked at the data and are very vocal and want to lead this. There has to be a want. Right. And then there has to be a look at the teams and development of those procedures, right? There has to be resources available, because as we've all been kind of saying, you're identifying kids that have needs. If you don't know what resources are available to support those, you don't have any business doing screening like this. And not only that, but it's looking to your community partners too. And a lot of our schools have really been able to expand and further develop their partnerships by doing a screening process. So it's kind of had these unintended consequences of like, we're not just identifying kids that need help, but we're also using this practice as a way to really expand a lot of our other mental health efforts, whether it's driven us to do resource mapping, and we've done that more systematically in this process, or whether it's led us to connect more with our SAP liaisons in different ways. We've had some schools that have had SAP liaisons on site for the day of the screen and really tried to kind of streamline the SAP process. We've also had schools that have reached out to crisis and really been able to have conversations about, hey, we're screening for suicide risk. This isn't a typical school day. We may be identifying a couple more kids than we might otherwise see in a typical day. So, trying to have those conversations with their crisis or other behavioral health partners in the community as they're going through this too. So, I 100% support it as an amazing practice, but also just can't say enough, I think, about the planning and infrastructure that needs to be in place for it.
Yeah, I will echo that. So we concluded our kind of piece with the Shields data feeling like we partnered with schools that felt like they were in a good space to do this, right? And so I think there are a lot of toolkits out there. I think it's hard as a school personnel to pick up a toolkit and be like, all right, I'm going to, work on screening now without some guidance. So I mentioned to you that I wrote Perri into this project. We are trying to apply for some additional funding to work with schools both within Pennsylvania and then nationally in this space on professional development to get them geared up. However, in the interim, we actually have 2 webinars we're doing in January, and I'll get the info to Steve. If you might be interested, you guys are welcome to hop on. We're going to kind of give a overview of some of the stuff we'll talk about, but the goal is to address some of the barriers that came up in the course of this conversation, like how do I deal with consent? How do I deal with confidentiality, right? And put school folks on the call so you can talk to each other, because nobody wants to hear from a general pediatrician how to do school-based hearing screening, right? And so I think, thanks. I think the opportunity to be able to interface with like-minded folks, both statewide and nationally, is a really neat opportunity to figure out how we could do this.
Just off that, that information will likely come out for PSEA members in the PSEA Extra, whenever that's shared with me.
Yep, I'll get it to you.
And see, we have an online question. What was that acronym again that you're using? The one that begins with P?
The Pennsylvania Commission for Crime and Delinquency.
I know, but can you tell us the acronym one more time?
PCCD.
Very good. All right. Very good. All right. Anybody have to wrap things up? Can we ask the community questions, or we do the last one?
We are over time by 1 minute, but I'll take one question.
Anybody have any quick burning questions they want to ask? I promise I won't scream into the microphone. Go ahead.
I do. I don't know. It's probably going to take a little bit more than 1 minute, so we can table it. But I'm so curious about the resources, especially being in Hempfield, being in Lancaster County. How are you accessing your resources?
One of our probably
Biggest, are they accessing the resources?
one of our biggest resources I think we lean on, we have used some of our PCD money to further develop our SAP program. Then in addition to that, we've really built a beautiful relationship with the community services group to have a really broad spanning school-based therapy where we can not only provide school-based therapy, but we can directly refer to a range of psychological or psychiatric services. And so that's been one unique way that we've been able to assist in our help seeking there. You can't have CSG, they're all ours, my. Joking, but we can talk about that later on. Most importantly, folks, if you have other questions, we'll probably be lingering around as our student group gets ready to set up. But most importantly, Mike, who pinched hit today, did an amazing job. We'll give Mike a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for our panel. I think that mental health piece in the screening is a very important thing to consider. And because as you know, mental health has had a significant increase in our kids since the pandemic. But thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.